Mr. Mayor, dear Jacques Attali, Mr. President of the region, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I hope that you will not be too concerned about my cough but I would like to say that I have been in China recently where the temperature was 45 degrees and air conditioning, well, all this together has had negative effects on me. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for inviting me to this forum. And it is a pleasure for me, and I find it very motivating, to be here in this Positive Economy Forum. And I should also add that I feel very happy to be able to address all of you in this region that I know well and that I'm very fond of. You have dedicated most of these sessions to the issue of global warming. When we speak of global warming, but what does this mean, in fact? I wonder if we should not speak of the climate disruption. Why? Because I know well this region, and in this region, if we say that the only effect of this climate disruption is that we will have 2 degrees centigrade more, which is not completely correct. I don't think people will feel too concerned about this. But in fact, we're speaking of something which goes beyond this, an increase of temperatures, 2 degrees centigrade. But if it was above 2 degrees, well, then for this region, but for all the planet, this would be a dramatic explosion of different hazards, events, tempests, increase of the oceans level, acidification of oceans, and also other difficulties that I will describe later on concerning health, food, migrations, and conflicts. So this would be the scenario. And this would be the climatic scenario we would have if we had more than 2 degrees increase of our temperatures. As I said before, you are devoting some thought to economy and societies in the futures. And therefore, I think that it is very pertinent to dedicate part of this forum to global warming or climatic disruption, because I think this is a vital concern. This is crucial because this will have an impact on our lives in the future. In less than 80 days now, we will have the COP21 conference starting. That means that we had 20 conferences before this one. Unfortunately, they did not pay off. And I will have the great honor of presiding the conference. Now, if we want this conference to be successful, and I'll tell you what we mean by successful, and Jacques Attali has also been joining us in this preparation, we will have to mobilize all governments because, as you know, the governments are those who will vote a text, and we will have 196 different contributions. But we also need the contribution of citizens, the civilian contribution, that is to say, of men and women, economists, academics, social entrepreneurs, GNOs, leaders of associations, representatives of other entities. All these people have to mobilize their efforts so as to preserve our planet. And this conference in Paris is therefore of paramount importance. And, dear Jack, I think I read one of your articles a few months ago where, as we say in the Quai d'Orsay, you felt a bit reluctant, not with respect to our capacity of delivering new messages during the COP21, but concerning the proposals that we may make. And I hope that all these proposals will make a success of this conference. Now, in less than 80 days from now, on the 30th of November, the international conference in Paris will take place. 196 different countries plus Europe, which is another stakeholder, 20,000 representatives, 20,000 observers, 3,000 journalists. And what will be at stake is to see how we can make our planet more sustainable. Now, very often, one of the questions which crops up is, what about the success of that conference? How can we have a successful conference? What I would like to say is that by the end of the conference, I will have to say, in a conclusive way, I hope that the agreement has been signed by all parties. But I think that today, if we look back into history, what is at stake is more vital than ever. And if these challenges are vital, it's due to very many factors. To start with, because the situation is worse. 2014 has been the warmest year we have ever registered. 2015 is probably going to be even warmer, and the month of August has been, at world level, probably one of the warmest one we have had. The global warming is aggravating, and the greenhouse gas effects, which is linked to human activity, are also increasing. And therefore, if we don't react, if we don't take the appropriate measures, we know what the scenario is going to be. The scenario will be an increase of 3, 4, 5, or maybe more degrees centigrade, which would be a disaster, not only at environmental level, but also for public health, for development as a whole, for our economies, for migration, for safety, and for peace. And therefore, at this stage, we have to react now, at this point in time, and not in a few years from now, because I think that what makes all the difference when it comes to this international conference and to all these negotiations is that we cannot wait anymore. The greenhouse gases, when they are produced in the atmosphere, will remain there for years and years, decades, and even centuries. So, having said this, if we don't take the appropriate decisions when we have to, then the situation will be irreversible. It's not only a negotiation which has to take place, but it is really a race, and because we have a ticking bomb there. And this is one of the main reasons for which today we have to make sure that we can be successful. Now, the other reason is that we have today conclusive scientific arguments. And I think that this is something we cannot push aside. This is something also which takes place in the United States. And the scientists of the International Group on Climate have shown that, and this is why some of them have received the Nobel Prize for Peace, that today there is really global warming taking place because of greenhouse effects. And this is anthropocentric. This is anthropocentric because caused by men. Therefore, that means that we have to make sure that we want to fight this. And we're fighting it more than we did in the past. If we had started doing this before, probably, I think that we would have been more aware of the gravity of the situation, and we would also have done more efforts so as to limit this, knowing that human beings are responsible of this overall warming of the planet. Therefore, we have to pay a tribute to these scientists who have helped us to view things in a different way and become more aware of what is going on. Now, the third reason is not only the fact that things are getting worse. It's not only because we have scientific-based arguments. There is a link between all this is correlated, but because we have major countries who felt reluctant, but now today they are committing to some agreements. For instance, China, a country I know well, and the of China understand now that it's not only for the sake of their own health and country, but also for the health of the planet that measures have to be taken. I would also like to mention the fact that awareness has been steered in the United States because the President of the United States is very much aware also of the gravity of the situation. But there is another reason which I think is to be considered, and there is an economy which can be more respectful of climate. I know that this is a very slow process which is starting to mobilize companies and different stakeholders of the economy, but this is taking place, and this can make us feel more optimistic. And thanks to the technological progress, therefore, this is possible. So the situation is changing. 5 years ago, the price of solar energy was twice as expensive as it is today. And today, we have more than 50% more of our capacities which are due to renewable energies. And in most countries, the renewable energies are not as expensive as those we have with carbon, with coal, or with other sources of energy. Therefore, coal today produces 2, oil 1, and gas 1 in terms of emissions. Therefore, the green transition is taking place today. People are more convinced this is being implemented not only in the North Hemisphere, but also in the South Hemisphere. Now, this is not only the fact that people have more skills to do this, that they have more talent or more competences, but just because we're more aware of what is at stake. Now, when will we be able to say that the conference will be successful? And what are the criteria to measure the success of this conference? What I would say that we have 4 interconnected factors. To start with, we have to speak of the legal agreement. And the second factor would be ENDC, intended national determined contribution. That means that each country, normally before the end of the year, before the end of November, will have to specify how they want to develop their energies in the forthcoming years. So a commitment of all countries. A third measure or a third aspect, it concerns the financial package of all these measures. And the fourth factor is what I've called, with my Peruvian colleague, an agenda for action, which will reflect all the commitments of non-state stakeholders. Now, who are these stakeholders? Local authorities, companies, businesses, and associations, all stakeholders of our civil society. Now, I would like to give you more details with respect to each one of these fundamental milestones and all these criteria, which I hope will ensure the success of our conference. To start with, coming back to the first point, as I said, we need a universal agreement. This has never been the case in the past. And according to what we know concerning this kinds of agreement, it has to be a agreement all countries have to implement, with all the legal constraints this implies. It has to be sustainable. I'll come back on this point. And all this should help us to avoid having an increase of temperatures, that is to say either 2 degrees or 1 degree. There's a discussion going on now concerning the increase of temperature. Therefore, we have to vote on a common text which has to be prepared upstream, and probably this can seem strange when it comes to the different procedures we have to envisage. But the fact is that we have negotiators of different countries and groups, working parties, which will meet in Bonn. Now, at this point, they still have not reached an agreement or a consensus with respect to the final document, which is too lengthy and there are too many options. 80 pages, that's too much for this kind of agreement. We have to make sure that we specify each one of the points which is contained in the text. Therefore, we, ministers, have asked the group or working party to speed up the procedure. And in October, they should be able to propose a text of 20 pages which will reflect the main options that we will discuss and for which we will find an agreement. Probably you have heard about the failure of the Copenhagen conference in 1929, and why did it fail at that time? Probably because upstream things had not been properly prepared at the very last minute. We had the leaders of our major countries of the planet, and they met during a whole evening. But that was not enough. Therefore, today we're doing things differently. That means that we have very complex issues to be addressed, and therefore things have to be prepared upstream because we know that we cannot find an agreement from one day to another. And you can't pull out of your hat solutions from one day to another. As I said before, I was not a specialist of climatic disruptions and of all the procedures we need. Now, I know more about this today. Today, I know that we have to find a balance with respect to the mitigation of emissions, adaptation to climatic changes, and the legal form of this agreement. It has to be, therefore, a constraint from a legal point of view, compulsory for all countries, and it should also not be blocked when it is ratified by the different countries. This is why today we're preparing this, as I said, very thoroughly, but we know that we have to be ambitious enough if we want our conference and this text to be a real success. So, as I said before, this is an agreement which should restrict the increase of temperatures, 2 degrees or 1 degree. Now, the second point I would like to mention, which is something new in the landscape, is that, as you know, before this kind of conference, each country throughout the world has to prepare a kind of memorandum where he explains what he plans to do in the 20 or 30 forthcoming years about energy transition. I think that this is really a fabulous input for our COP21 conference. Why? Because we have 196 parties or countries, and we already have 60 contributions, which account for more than 60% of the CO2, of the greenhouse gases. That means that we know that countries feel very concerned today about these greenhouse gases, but it's not enough. And I think that as president of the COP conference, I would like to insist on the fact that we need more contributions coming from other countries and that we have to speed up the whole process. And I hope that this message will be clearly conveyed. We're going to be faced with another issue, as I just said. We have to make sure that we will not go beyond 1.5 or 2 degrees increase. Of course, this scenario is more optimistic than the 5 or 6 degrees which have been announced by scientists and experts. Now, if we look into all these contributions, as I said, 60 contributions we have received, I think that the average increase would be 3 degrees, which is more reassuring than 5 or 6, but it's still not the 2 degrees we're looking for. And therefore, if we don't want to be too contradictory, we have to find new mechanisms. And I'll try to illustrate this with a gesture. That is to say, instead of going up to 3 degrees, we have to restrict the increase of temperatures to 2 degrees. And what do I mean by this? If we don't want to have too many contradictions and failures, we have to announce major meetings every 5 years, where we'll be able to look into the situation, see what are the technological breakthroughs which have taken place, what is the situation. We know with the satellites today what we are facing in terms of greenhouse gases, and with a non-intrusive mechanism that we have to set up, we have to make sure that all countries will review their contribution. But this has to be a progress. This is what we call no backsliding or no backtracking. And if we're able to do this with no backtracking, then the Paris COP21 conference will be fully meaningful, because that means that we'll be able to know what the mechanism or the adjustment mechanism will be in the future. Now, the third aspect concerns funding and technologies. I think that in the last few weeks, we have been progressing in this field. In Copenhagen in 2029, there was a commitment which was as follows. The countries of the North Hemisphere by 2020 had to provide $100 million per year to poorer countries for climatic issues. Now, we're not talking of $100 billion, which is public money, $100 billion, but it's not only public, it's also banks and private funding, which I'm talking about when I speak of $100 billion. And this is our goal. We've maintained the goal. This is something we're heading to. We have to move forward on this track, because poor countries will not accept to commit to this kind of agreement of COP21 if we don't abide by our own commitments in terms of funding. For instance, when I discuss with my African friends in African countries all these issues, they always highlight the fact that we are also responsible of the situation. Now, of course, they need funding. They need technologies, because they're not the ones who are producing the greenhouse gases. They're not the ones who are producing most of this. This is what they say when I talk to them, and they're right. So we really have to help them. And we didn't know at that point in 2029 what would happen by 2020. And this is why we have to have OECD, which will provide us with all the results we need in October, all the data we need to tell us, therefore, what are the numbers we're going to need in terms of budget for of the northern countries, the different multilateral agencies, the private sector, and so on. When we have all these numbers on the table, well, then we're going to have to ask other countries to make an effort so as to reach the $100 billion I've just mentioned. Now, I believe that rich countries, among which there's France, will have to make more efforts. Our German friend said, we are ready to make these efforts. I think that our friends from UK will also say the same, and France is going to make another effort. But we have to convince other countries like the Canadians, the Japanese, and the Americans to contribute more to this funding. And this has to be done starting. We have to find an agreement starting right away, and this before November. And the multilateral banks, for instance, the World Bank, the Bank for African Development, and very many other banks will also have to contribute more so as to make sure that we will find the appropriate funding for climatic change, because the effort we've made up to now is not enough. It's not enough. We're going to need new mechanisms, too, so as to channel all the private funding coming from companies and businesses, so as to make sure that we can mitigate climatic disruption and develop sustainable and environmental and respectful economies. So there is a goal, and we all know that the goal is to produce more energy, but with less carbon. And therefore, the $100 billion fund, which is our main commitment, is, I think, a major aspect of action, but also of trust. And in the forthcoming weeks, we're going to have many meetings. Next week, we have the General Assembly of United Nations, and there will be a meeting bringing together the head of governments of different countries in the world. We'll also have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund meeting in Peru. There will be the G20 in Turkey. And thanks to all these meetings, I think that we have to make sure we know what is the agenda and what the momentum will be, so as to make sure that by 2020 we have this fund of 100 billion. So this is the first pillar, the legal agreement. The second pillar, the financial agreement and technology. And the fourth pillar is commitment. Commitment of non-state stakeholders, that is to say, all of you, what we call agenda for action. This is something completely new, but I think it is crucial also. This is another crucial milestone. And what you're doing now in this forum is one of the milestones. Now, I think that if commitment of governments is fundamental, we also have to motivate civil society. All stakeholders have to be part of this. And I believe that positive economy brings together all these stakeholders. This also means that we are preparing step by step what we want to build, an economy which will be a positive economy for future generations and respectful of the environment. I'm strongly convinced about the fact that the preservation of our planet is something we're all concerned about. Of course, we have to mobilize the companies and businesses with the carbon balance so as to avoid further climatic disruption, and so as to ensure green growth or development. And I know that there will be a progress. There's already a progress taking place. Things are changing because we see in the companies and businesses, because they're more socially aware of the importance of all these challenges, new behaviors, and they are helping us to develop the energy transition. But I think that there are further measures which are now going to take place. For instance, it concerns, on one hand, the tariff of carbon, or which should help us to set up this new economy. And let's face it, if we want to abandon this carbon-based economy, which has developed throughout the 19th century, with a zero-carbon economy, we need renewable energies, which are not as expensive, not as costly. And the carbon energy has to be more expensive. Therefore, we have to find a tax so as to make sure that the carbon producers will not consider that they can do this indefinitely and that they will not have to pay for it. Therefore, there is something new taking place within the companies and the businesses, but also at state level, because climatic disruption is today a threat for development. And this is also an awareness which has emerged among trade unions. I was part of a meeting of international trade unions and the Economic and Social Council in Paris, and they really stressed the fact that the trade unions and trade unionists are very much aware that they want social development. They want a fair development on a planet where there is no hope, there will be no employment. And I would like to wrap up my presentation by insisting on the role of the different local communities and authorities. We see that they produce also a great amount of greenhouse gases. But if we imagine new solutions for collective transport or green transport, if you process or recycle your waste differently, if you also have purification stations for wastewaters, if you have more positive energies, if you have greener spaces in a city, this will have a major and positive impact with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. And I don't know if you've read one of the articles which was published in the press recently, but American and Chinese major cities decided to commit so as to bring down their greenhouse gases, and there are remarkable initiatives which are now being taken by all these cities in different areas of the world. And I would also like to highlight the fact that in this region, Normandy, and in the region close to Normandy, we have new approaches which are very exciting. For instance, there is an energy project licitation so as to award the regions which will present innovative projects. In May, there's also the development of windmill energy. And I think that Normandy is probably the first region which has offshore wind energy. And you've also been launching projects so as to see what are the marine renewable energies, and also in terms of transport with electromobility, with the possibility of electrical supplies for public transport, individual cars, and La Basse Normandie, which is the other region, also has been very innovative, and there have been very many investments made in Cherbourg and in other towns. I think that all these decisions, which are very fruitful, and I congratulate you for that, will enable you to be pioneering regions in terms of energy transition. And I'm quite convinced about the fact that you will become one of the first eco and green regions of France. I will conclude, and I hope that I have not been too lengthy and too disruptive with my cough. But I would like to conclude by saying that the COP21 conference in Paris is not going to solve all the issues or the pending issues, but it has to be a major milestone. It has to be a turning point for all of us. And if we reach a universal agreement, which is ambitious enough, if we are able to bring together contributions of most governments and countries, and if we have commitments of richer countries for funding and technology, if they accept to develop solidarity, if we bring together many stakeholders who are not governmental stakeholders, then I believe that this conference will become an historical conference. And the positive economy is an economy which is concerned about future generations. And this is why I would like to make two conclusive remarks. The first remark is that since the 19th century, the economic development has been based on what we call carbon-based energies, coal, gas, for instance. Now, if we want to have non-carbon energies with the growth we need, then we have to restrict the CO2 emissions. This is mandatory, and this means that we need other readjustments and changes. Now, this is something which is a wonderful opportunity for our development and for jobs creation. And if I'm here today, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here in this forum, is because I wanted to convey this message. I think that if we want to fight against the climatic disruption, this is a wonderful opportunity, as I just said, so as to have a new growth in Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, but I've studied ancient Greek when it was taught at school. The word which says risk and chance is the same word. Risk and chance, two things which can be said with the same word. And it is an opportunity. It is a risk, but it's also a chance. This is really the key of positive economy. And the very last conclusive remark, I would like to quote Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss, in a book that I've been reading again, which is wonderful, Triste Tropique, Sad Tropics. Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist who was a great academician, says, and I will quote this last sentence, which is very short, but which can help us to meditate, and I quote, "The world started without human beings." It's true. But the risk is that the world will continue without human beings too. And this is really what is at stake. That is to say that we may not have human beings anymore on the planet. We have to avoid this risk. We have to avoid the destruction of humankind by men themselves. And if we want to avoid this, we need universal awareness, but also universal mobilization. This, I believe, what you're all looking for in this forum, and I would like to thank you and congratulate you for what you've been doing. Thank you.
Merci Laurent Fabius. Merci pour cette.
Thank you, Laurent Fabius. Thank you for this presentation, this very, very complete presentation. Would you please answer a few questions? This will add to your speech, which was already extremely accurate regarding the stakes for the COP21 meeting. You said that the climate is something that we're all concerned by. How do you combine civil society and young people with the COP21 meeting? Well, in the preparation, COP21, the French summit, will take place in Paris-Le Bourget on 30th of November and 1st of December. We took contribution from the French education system, youth associations, international associations. We asked them to contribute with their ideas. Of course, they're not going to vote in lieu of our governments and heads of state, but we want them to be able to act peacefully and encourage our politicians to take the right decisions. And there is also something more local for the local département de la Seine-Saint-Denis, where the young people will physically contribute to the organization of Le Bourget COP21 meeting. And again, the meeting will take place between the 30th of November and the 11th of December. And we have organized a number of other conferences as satellite conferences all around the COP21 meeting, during which young people will be able to share their opinions and learn also a lot. Therefore, young people will be at the very heart of the process. Let us be careful. The climate. We know that the climate issue, if we don't do anything, will have catastrophic consequences on the long run, and we have to do something now. But the young people can also show us the way, set an example. They can also play an essential role in order to make their own parents or grandparents aware of the situation. This will be what we call reversed education. I do wish that the young people will understand how important this is and will help us. Well, less than 3 months away now from the conference. According to the figure, 60 countries out of 95 have already set objectives for the reduction of greenhouse effect gases. Now, the other 35 have very little time left to take decisions. What would be the likelihood of failure? Well, I tried to explain that national contributions were only one part of the question being raised, not the whole subject for the meeting. Now, 60 have already taken commitments, but 60 out of 95% means 60 to 70% of the emissions. And if we put some pressure on the governments, we can try and encourage those countries which have not already published their commitments to do so very quickly. There are two categories of countries. Some countries are finding themselves in a difficult situation for technical reasons. Drawing up a clear, understandable document, which in substance says this is our program for energy between now and 2030. For some countries, this is difficult. But there are other countries which are in a position to do so and haven't published their contribution so far, whereas technically speaking, they are in the capacity to do it. Countries like India, 1,400,000,000 inhabitants, one of the first green effect gases emission makers will have to take a decision, and therefore I would like to take the opportunity to encourage all the countries to meet their obligations and do so quickly. Well, companies and businesses are already committing themselves regarding carbon tariffs. Some companies are asking for carbon taxes to be paid at the borders. Is France going to take the leadership on that particular project? I don't think a final decision will be taken in Paris on this subject. If we consider legal issues, it's impossible that we vote a law that will be applied by all countries and will be binding for all countries. The situation in China is obviously different from the situation in the United States or in Germany. This being said, let's face it, in the decisions taken during the summit in Paris, there will not be a paragraph which states the carbon price will be ... But we are going to work in that direction. And for those of you who are interested, in the coming weeks in the United States and Japan or elsewhere in Europe, there will be many initiatives taken. I see Mr. Ferraud here, for instance. Some people, we have some very good experts in this field. I don't believe there will be a single technique. And what I do hope is that the tariff system will be implemented with corridors. There will be a bottom price and a top price, and in time the two prices will come closer together. I hope I have been clear enough. I hope you understand how important this is. I'll give you an example. Take an oil-producing country. This country becomes aware that there are changes taking place in the world and understands that since its development was based on a carbon-based energy and now it needs to turn towards a less carbon-based energy source, obviously this is going to be a problem for that particular country, and therefore the country should foresee evolutions. Evolutions will not take place overnight. Technological evolutions take time. At the same time, in our current system, if we ourselves want to go in a certain direction, push the others to go in the same direction, carbon does have to have a price. Otherwise, it will be free of charge or falsely free of charge, because the negative impact on the planet will be huge. This is what we call externalities, and we need to bring them inside the country, and this means we have to pay a price. Too many countries and well, there are very many regions and countries that are making progress in that direction. You'd be surprised to find out that some regions in China already applied this kind of tariff. We tried in Europe, but it didn't work. The prices simply, the tariff simply collapsed. But I think we have to try again and take the opportunity of the summit in Paris to develop this idea. One last question. Manuel Valls and the President have asked that export credit for new coal power plants be frozen. What does it mean? What does this provision mean? Well, it's a provision that I was in favor of, although my activism was relatively discreet. Coal combustion releases a lot of greenhouse effect gases. And there are countries where they extract a lot of carbon. It's a source of income. India, for instance. In France, we have companies which used to work with coal power plants without mechanisms that catch carbon. Now there are mechanisms that allow us to work with coal and yet not release any CO2 in the atmosphere because the CO2 is being caught. Now, I told the President of the Republic that we were inconsistent because on the one hand, we plead to limit greenhouse effect gas emissions, and at the same time, we give subsidies, we give tax incentives, capacity credits to companies that work with coal. This could have consequences on employment. We have to be careful. Coal power plants, if we say a coal power plant cannot work anymore, cannot be operated anymore, there will be consequences on the coal plant itself and the people working in it. This brings me back to the positive economy subject. I think we should have a long-term vision. A long-term vision doesn't mean that we're not worried about short-term issues, except that our politicians, men and women representing the French administration, must take everything in consideration, short-term and long-term alike. Now, encouraging people to use dirty coal is very much the contrary of what we're trying to achieve to have a clean planet. So when is this provision going to be implemented? Immediately. Well, thank you very much.